to really, I think, drill into what we mean by the energy transition. As many of you may or may not know, Carbon Tracker is a not-for-profit think tank. We're entirely philanthropically funded. I think what's unique and interesting about Carbon Tracker is we're all former financial market professionals. Probably the largest part of the Carbon Tracker team is a team of 7 former investment bank financial analysts. So our ultimate mission is to align financial market and capital market risk with climate risk, with a particular focus on the energy sector. And we do that through using investment-grade financial analysis and regulatory analysis. We are probably best known for the work we did translating a key part of the climate science, the carbon bubble, into the language of our audience, the financial markets, in a form that tells them you have a risk now. You have a risk issue now you need to understand and to manage. And along the way, we've created a whole new financial lexicon, terms like carbon bubble, unburnable carbon, fossil fuel risk premium, an orderly and disorderly financial transition. But I think now we have an opportunity to really drill into what that means, because ultimately, our vision, if you like, is that we play our part in delivering, by 2050, a climate-secure global energy system. Now, that's all very well to say that in broad terms, but the work that Carbon Tracker wants to go on and do post-2016 is to map out what that means, provide the benchmark for an orderly transition to a climate-secure global energy system within which we have very little, if any, financial dislocation or stranded assets. I think contrary to popular belief, we actually want to avoid stranded assets. We want to avoid value destruction. So we've got a fantastic panel here to really, I think, explore what that means in practice. I'm not going to introduce everybody to begin with. I'll introduce the panelists as we go along. I have some interesting questions for each of them. And I'm going to start with Pierre Ducret, Chair for the Institute for Climate Economics and Special Advisor for Climate Change and COP21 at the Caisse des Dépôts. Pierre, so we talk about this low-carbon energy transition. So is the transition to a low-carbon energy system already underway? And critically, in the context of climate change and avoiding dangerous catastrophic climate change, which the politicians have agreed is 2 degrees, maybe some scientists disagree, think that's even 2 degrees is too dangerous, but I think we have to go with the consensus around, the political consensus and legal consensus around 2 degrees. If that transition has started, is it fast enough to deliver the climate-secure energy system we need in time, avoiding the disruptive changes and stranded assets and value destruction?
Good morning, everybody. I'm sure it has definitely begun. The problem is that we have to accelerate it if we want to comply with what we have to do and to be short just to respect our carbon budget, which is, as you know, 1,000 gigaton left. After that, we have to go carbon neutral, net zero. But not to come back on the transition, the whole economy itself, I would say that the most striking movement in Carbon Tracker took a very important part in it. The fact that the financial world is now in movement on this target. And that's completely new. I would say that 2 years ago still, the financial industry was considering that it was neutral as regards the climate issue. Neutral. I mean, it was not the job of the finance industry to deal with the problem. It was the job of governments to send the good signals to economy, to put a price on carbon, and just after that, it would be plug and play. we will deliver green finance if you send the good signals to the economy. And we will align in our portfolio management, in our loan books, lending books, as regard the banking industry, and that's all. I think that this position has dramatically changed, especially first because of a new conscience of risks, which have been very well defined by Mark Carney. 3 types of risks: physical risks, transition risks, litigation risks. And that this conscience is now growing among the financial industry, pushing it to, in all its different businesses, insurance, of course, banks, and asset owners and managers, to take its own part of responsibility. The financial industry cannot do anything, cannot do the whole thing, cannot do the whole transition by itself, but we have our own part of responsibility because we have our own risks if we don't do it with a sufficient anticipation, because if we don't anticipate enough, it will be done anyway, but it will be done in a great disorder with a great destruction of value, as you said, Anthony. That's the reason why the Caisse des Dépôts Group, for example, took during the 2015 year new commitments on this issue, new commitments that consist in committing to decarbonize, to begin, 55 billion equity portfolio directly managed to begin. It's a portfolio coming from the direct management of Caisse des Dépôts itself, as well as from CNP, Caisse Nationale de Prévoyance, one of the first life insurers, which is a Caisse des Dépôts subsidiary, one of the first life insurers in Europe, and to decarbonize it by 20% by 2020. We think that we can do it starting from our 2015 footprint that we established with an internal method which will be audited. We can do it mainly by engagement and by first-in-class methods. We launched a very strong engagement approach by sending a large inquiry to all the companies in which we have some shares. We can say today that all these companies have now a very high level of conscience of their own responsibilities themselves. Probably we will say that the next step will be for them, or for most of them, to produce, and it will be our role to push in this direction, to produce long-term strategies to align on the 2 degrees target, which is still to be done.
Okay.
And which will be the condition for us, of course,
yes,
to align with that. Excuse me, Anthony, just a last point. The next step for us would be to do the same thing with the delegated management. It will be the job for 2016.
So I want to direct the next question to Eva Halvarsen, the Chief Executive Officer of the AP2 Pension Fund. Now, Carbon Tracker's founder, Mark Campanale, often talks about this disconnect. The INDCs add up to, we're told, getting us to 2.7 degrees. It's still not enough, and more work to do. But that still represents potentially a 20 to 30% cut in emissions over the next 3 decades. Yet, the demand projections of many in the fossil fuel companies is that demand for their products will grow 20 to 30% over the next 20 to 30 years. So there's a big disconnect here. Carbon Tracker's new report identifies a danger zone. So we sort the projects between those that we will need. So we will need a lot of fossil fuels as part of the transition over the next 20 to 30 years, even in 2 degrees and the 900 gigatons. So we sort those projects in terms of those that pose less climate risk and less financial risk from the projects that are high climate risk and high financial risk. And we call this a so-called danger zone. So how do you, as an owner of many of these companies, an investor in the markets, deal with that disconnect and the potential value destruction that could result from many of those companies investing in projects that do not make climate or financial sense, and it's those future projects that are invested in that could become stranded assets, could destroy the value of the investments that you make?
That was a challenging question, of course, but let me start with saying that I agree what's been said earlier today and here about that we see the transition towards a low-carbon society and that it has started, and it's very encouraging to see so many different stakeholders here, because I think that's very important. Not only governments, but companies and investors and consumers have their own way to make this happen. And from that perspective, I think investors like us at AP2 and the financial sector, we have a very important role to play. I see us as catalysts or drivers for change. But we heard earlier that someone talked about 21 as when you grow up. And I'm not sure that the financial sector really is, we might have turned 21, but we are still learning quite a lot, so we're not that adult from that perspective. But coming back to us as a catalyst for change, if we are to be that, we have to increase our knowledge about these issues, and by that we need information. It may sound very basic, but investors need more information on how companies are working in transitioning their business models towards a 2-degree target. And many companies understand this, and they meet our questions or demands from us as investors in a very positive way. I have, for example, we put forward, AP2 together with a lot of other investors, successful resolutions at the AGMs of BP, Shell and Statoil last year. And in those cases, the boards of those companies, they agreed to expand their reporting on what they do from a post-2035 scenario, and also how their R&D plans look when it comes to energy, renewable energy solutions. And this kind of information is absolutely vital for us to be able to analyze the different scenarios and the different risks that we see. And the risk for value destruction that you mentioned in your report. So if we are to avoid investments in the danger zone, as you call it, we must decide whether do we want to stay in this company, or maybe we just want our money back, as you also talk about in the report. In that case, because we believe that the company has no plan or are able to change. And if not, if we have information, we can decide to act as those catalysts and encourage and support the companies into changing. But without more and better information, it's hard for us or impossible for us to support the companies in the transition. And with that said, that was from an engagement kind of perspective. I also think that investors need to assess the risk of value destruction in our own portfolios. At AP2, we have analyzed the coal, energy and utility sector and decided to divest from a number of companies because, in our view, these companies don't have a business model that's viable in the long term. And for us, it's impossible to keep them as an investment. It increases the risk in our portfolio. And as we have heard today, there are a lot of interesting ways forward when it comes to, for instance, solar or water, when it comes to a smooth energy transition. And for us, we must constantly learn more. This wasn't part of our DNA just a couple of years ago. We have to learn more. If we don't do that, we can't. We have to understand the world that we invest in and the companies. And so finally, I think that for us, information and disclosure is extremely important. We need to know, we need to understand how the companies are changing their business model, and that is a very important step if we want to close the danger zone gap.
Yes.
Yeah.
So change and understand a changing world, in effect. And when the world changes, I think there's a role for regulators. And we have here Paul Fisher, Deputy Head of the Prudential Regulatory Authority in the UK and Executive Director for Supervisory Risk and Regulatory Operations at the Bank of England. And I also understand Governor Carney has given you the remit to look at climate across the Bank of England. So I guess the Bank of England's climate czar, if I could be so bold. And I think that, what's incredibly interesting, I think many of us have been to a lot of these climate summits over the years, some more than others. But I'm pretty certain we're still checking, but I do not think there has been a major climate summit before where you have had the governor of a major central bank attend, and certainly not in his other capacity, the head of the Financial Stability Board, a major financial body like that, attend a climate summit. I mean, that tells you, I think, a lot. It tells you a lot about the interest the financial markets are now beginning to take in this topic and how they see it. But Paul, for the Bank of England, this was kicked off by two things. The request from DEFRA, the Department of Energy, Food and Rural Affairs, to look at the impact of climate change on the insurance industry. And you've produced a report on that, and obviously the G20 asking the Financial Stability Board to look at it, and obviously the governor is chair of that. But could you perhaps talk a little bit about the report that came out recently and the findings in that, and what the bigger implications are from this report?
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. And you may well wonder what's the central bank got to do with climate change. And I think this report we've published in September, which I think is the first central bank report of its kind, takes a particular look through the lens of one of our objectives, which is us as regulators of the insurance sector. What are the risks to the firms we supervise in terms of this, and what do we expect them to do about it? And we spend a lot of time, we have some expertise in-house, catastrophe risk modelling and so on, as we have from supervisors. We spent a lot of time talking with the industry itself and with outside academics to try to put the report together. And hopefully we've delivered a report which has a framework in it for thinking about those risks, importantly just in the report itself. Now it's the insurance sector, so we look at general insurers, life insurers and reinsurers, and we look at both the assets and the liabilities side of the balance sheet, whereas with banks the interest is always on the asset side rather than liabilities. We identify three risks, which, going from the obvious to the less obvious, physical risks, transition risks, and legal liability risks, and we'll get more interesting as we go on. The physical risks people will be well familiar with in terms of weather-related events, and what we've seen is payouts from the insurance industry on weather-related events triple since the 1980s. Now that's principally because they've been writing more business, so there's a business opportunity for them. But we've also seen evidence at the margin that the size of the losses is increasing because of climate change. And the example we quoted was a report by Lloyd's of London, which suggested that the surge storm losses in New York from Superstorm Sandy were 30% higher because of the 20-centimetre rise in sea level that had been observed at Battery Park since the 1950s. So a direct correlation between change in sea level and the losses of the insurance industry. Now, we think the general insurers, who are mostly affected by the physical risk on their liability side, are pretty well prepared for this. They've got good catastrophe modelling, they've got a one-year business model for their pricing, and they're reasonably well capitalised. But we could see some disruption come through in various ways. One is that they may be unwilling to write insurance for particular classes of business in certain areas. So flood insurance on floodplains being a classic example. That might draw in the public sector to have to provide that service. Mm-hmm. We could see that the diversification assumptions they've got, for example, around windstorm correlations, changing and dramatically changing how much capital they have to hold or the prices of the insurance they charge. And we also see indirect risks. So you may have a typhoon in the Far East which doesn't lead to insured losses, but if you've written business disruption insurance to a Western company that depends on supplies in that region, they get the losses through that way. So there's various ways in which this gets more complicated for the general insurers. That's the liability side. There's also risks to the asset side, of course, particularly to the life insurers who have long-term assets, which might well involve property, and the property could well be at risk. If you're really unfortunate, you'll have invested in a property and written the insurance policy on it. You get caught on both sides of the balance sheet. So that's the physical risks, which are relatively well known. More interestingly, are the transition risks. And here we take the path from here to a 2-degree economy and say, what are the risks then? This starts to bring in the discussion around stranded assets that people may have invested in. But more generally, stranded assets are only a small part of that. You get all sorts of policy risks come in. To the extent that policy is unpredictable, that can suddenly change the relevant values of financial assets which these companies have invested in, and could do so unexpectedly in various ways. We also have business models that they may have written insurance policies for a sector which is in decline and have to shift their business somewhere else. So those transition risks could be quite important. And thirdly, more interestingly, legal liability risks, which are where if somebody has been responsible for causing climate change or was responsible for mitigating it, they could get sued by the people who are suffering losses from climate change. And the insurance companies may have written insurance, liability insurance, officers and directors insurance, for example, to the relevant people who are getting sued. As yet, we haven't seen very many cases successfully taken to court, but it's beginning to happen. At the margin, you're starting to see the courts take a more sympathetic view to the claimants. We're yet to see what the penalties will be in the Volkswagen case, or whether the directors there will be covered by their insurance policy, for example. That's the sort of thing you're getting at, and you saw it in things like asbestos in the past. So we've got these whole set of risks that the insurance sector need to be aware of. We're going to be pursuing that as their supervisors going forward. What's their risk management policies? Are they aware of the risks they've got? Are they looking at portfolios? That will undoubtedly cause some change, in particular, in the asset composition of the insurers as investors, and we have already seen that start to happen.
And that's a really interesting point, isn't it? We've seen the Attorney General's, the New York Attorney General's office mount an investigation that could have criminal consequences for Exxon, that in many ways mirrors some of the early tobacco litigation. Now, if I remember going back to my legal days, if you were fraudulent and deliberately carried out an act, that may void your insurance. So again, that could be quite a concern, I think, for many directors and non-executive directors.
That's right. To the extent somebody's done something fraudulent, that liability insurance may not carry through, and that would be good news for the insurers, but bad news for the individuals concerned. But people have to look at what their responsibilities are that they are legally liable for, and make sure, as we're making them do in the banking sector, they will have to make sure they are acting with integrity and consistent with their legal liabilities going forward.
Okay. Gerard Mittet, Vice President for Climate and Energy at Total, one of the biggest oil and gas companies in the world. And a company I think it's fair to say many see as at the cutting edge of transition, one of the biggest investors in solar, for example. So maybe best placed to talk about, to answer this following question. How do the energy incumbents avoid, I think, the curse that many business, dominant business incumbents have faced over business history, the likes of Kodak, the likes of Olivetti, the steam locomotive manufacturers, etc., who've never survived the technological transitions when they've come. They've been replaced by new companies. So how do you deal with this changing world, the disruptive technologies that are emerging? I mean, how can you emulate, the exceptions that prove the rule, the likes of GE, IBM, and I heard, BMW that started out as an aircraft manufacturer and now has become one of the most successful car companies in the world. Should the incumbent energy companies seek to transition, to turn themselves into clean energy companies, or is that something beyond their expertise and psychology, if you like? And is it better for the shareholders that they accept they are now ex-growth stocks and it's more about being a yield stock, maximizing returns from the existing resources in line with the low-carbon transition over the next 20 to 30 years? What's your view of the best road? I mean, is it one or the other? Is there an alternative?
Well, there is many aspects in your question, obviously. And I think one of the first things to have is lucidity. Is to be clear that the science is clear, that the mobilization of the society is very clear. There is 180 NDC. So this is a reality. The reality also is that oil and gas emit or is responsible to emit 1/3 of the emissions. So we are in this question. This is absolutely clear. And being lucid and mean also put your strategy in a 2-degree centigrade world of the future. And this is what's totally doing, but not only. And I will just point out the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which is a joint of 10 companies, which recently, 16th of October, put themselves in front of the people and saying, yes, we are working in a 2-degree centigrade future. And this is very different because WCS is not about word, it's nothing cynical, it's something about action, share engagement, and practical solution. So this is a sign that lucidity is coming. And this is very important. First, to realize the question, to look at it. The second thing, if I come back a little bit to Total, there is a different time scale in this subject. And as far as Total, we are very well positioned in some markets which are compatible with the 2-degree future. I will take the example of the gas. As you know, if you take the scenario of the International Energy Agency to 2030 and 2040, there is more gas production in 2040 than now. So it's a market which will not disappear from one day to the other for a very simple reason. The reason is that when you burn gas, you have much more energy than if you burn coal. So the traduction for a company like my company is simple, is that today, gas production represents 50% of our production. It was only 1/3 10 years ago. And gas is not moving everywhere, it is true, but we are very strong in LNG also to move gas. So that's the first part. Then we have renewable energy, which is a very fast-growing market. If you take the new energy, solar and wind, it will go from 1% of the global mix now to 6% and 10% in 2040. So it's a very big growing market. And here we are very well positioned, as you know, with our subsidiary SunPower being one of the biggest solar company in the world. It's about 7,000 people, 2.5 billion of revenue. And recently we have this power plant in California, which is about 700 megawatt, which is very significant. It's nearly a nuclear plant. So this is the first move. It's not sufficient. And I think this should go with very sound and realistic investment discipline. And there is many parts also of that, but I will insist on two. First, we integrate in our investment decision a cost of carbon. Today on the planet, there is very little place where there is a cost to emit CO2. But we integrate it in every decision. We integrate a certain price so that we can be more sure that even or when a cost of carbon will happen, this investment will remain profitable. And the second thing is that we have a very strict and increasing cost discipline to be able to be profitable, even in the case the price of oil would remain low. And this means working on our cost structure, diminish our cost, innovation, and very strict investment discipline. we will not take an investment decision if it's not resistant, even in a low-cost environment. So this is important. So lucidity, we will be positioned in the market, and sound and realistic discipline. And there is a fourth element which is very important for us. It's, I don't know if we call it advocacy, but doing the best we can so that the surrounding in which the business happens is compatible with the 2 degrees. And for that, we think that giving a price to the emission, the price of the emission to the atmosphere is key. Giving the price to CO2 emission is absolutely the compulsory thing to do, and we advocate mainly on that with also other companies. As you have maybe seen, we have this declaration paying for carbon that we put in the spring, advocating for a price of carbon. So why? It is true that sometimes people say, but are you mad? You want a price of carbon, this is your product. This is not the way to see the thing. The way to see the thing is that change will happen. And this change should happen in the most orderly, efficient, technology-neutral manner. And the best way to do that, to our view, is to give a price to carbon. So we advocate strongly to give a price of carbon. So this is a few clues about it. And we don't have to forget that change is also an opportunity. And I think, I don't fully agree with everything you say. I think oil and gas companies, at least some of them, are very well positioned to help in this transition. Why? Because first, they know very well the energy market. It is their job. They know the market, they know how it works. Second, most of them are very international, operate in many countries, 100 countries for total. And the third part is that they have a huge technology capacity that can make evaluate, and financial capacity also. So maybe not oil and gas companies are the same, obviously, and you cannot speak at once like that. But there is advantage to see them as an agent of the change, if they have the will to do so. And some of them have the will to do so. So this is the way I could answer your question, which is not a simple one. It is true. The first one is to realize the question. It is a real question. But there is a solution, and there is a way for this company to evolve and to be profitable in the future and to help the change in the future. Thank you.
Gerard, thank you. And last, but by no means least, Anne Simpson, who, a new title, Investment Director of Global Governance for the Californian Pension Fund, I think one of the biggest pension funds in the world, and certainly in the United States, CalPERS. And a pension fund that's been very engaged in these discussions now for quite a few years. So, question to you, Anne. How can investors, shareholders, and other financial institutions have the greatest impact, or what is your role, put another way, if any, in driving this low-carbon energy transition? Is it purely about investing in the new clean companies and technologies? But is it also about divesting from fossil fuel companies? We've heard a lot about divesting, and that there's a legislation now in California around that. Or is it through engagement or a combination of these? And if it's through engagement, what form should that engagement take? Because we believe that we believe in engagement as an organization, although we welcome divestment because it has been a massive cut-through and has created pressure like nothing else. But we want to move the mainstream financial markets. But there's no aggregate, there's no benchmark. I mean, people doing different things in engagement, but what's the additive benefit of that engagement? How do we ensure that engagement from all the different financial institutions and pension funds adds up to the aggregate whole, i.e. taking us to that climate-secure energy system?
Thank you very much. My microphone fell off, and I've done my own little amateur job putting it back. I don't know if can you hear me? Is that better?
Yes, c'était bon.
Yes, ça va bien. So here's the thing about CalPERS. What comes from being... He's a technician, apparently. Bravo. Merci, monsieur. You see, adaptation to new roles, it's all possible. Thank you, Pierre. What comes from being a very big fund? So as Anthony said, we're a $300 billion fund, and our liabilities to our pensioners run for the best part of 100 years. So if we shut the doors in the morning, we'd still have to be paying pensions for about 100 years. So that's the perspective we bring to this. We're so big, we have nowhere to hide. We actually need the financial markets, the system to, sorry, I'm going to hold it, the system to work. So when you talk about what do we do, it's not a question of or, it's a question of and. We must, first of all, make sure that the market is functional. And dysfunction is evident in two main areas at the moment. One, there are subsidies which give fossil fuels a free lunch, and we have carbon gets a free ride. So getting carbon priced and getting subsidies removed is really important. And one of the calculations floating around this week is that there's more money being spent on fossil fuels each year, 40 times more than has been committed to the new climate financing. So there's real scope there for redirecting public money. The other thing, if we're going to be able to hold companies to account, is we need to think of ourselves as owners, not as investors. And I think that's a shift in mindset for pension funds. But that means then we need investor rights. So you can't look at engagement unless you're willing to take on the investor rights agenda. And in the United States, which is the biggest capital market, with the biggest energy companies, you do not automatically have the right, for example, to hire and fire the board. So one of our big areas of work with other funds like New York City and Norges and Viva has been to get the right to nominate directors to the board, because the people making the decisions on the board need to be what we're calling climate competent. We need people on boards who can be forward-looking and visionary and tackle these changes. And part of this, unproductive dialogue of will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you join the dance, is because boards come out of a monoculture in big oil and old coal, where they're not able to understand these new opportunities. So investor rights is a big part of the engagement agenda. Then, as Eva said, we need the reporting to be able to understand what's going on with these companies. And let me give you an example on that. We've just mapped our own carbon footprint just to see what our, shoe size is on this particular issue. And we found that out of the 10,000 companies that we own in public markets, in 47 markets, less than 100 of them are responsible for 50% of the emissions associated with our portfolio. So we're not talking about taking on the world, we're talking about taking on a very strategic, targeted group of companies. And it's not just oil and gas, other sectors are involved. We've got food and beverages, utilities, of course, transport, construction, chemicals. So I think the owners of the world have an opportunity to play a strategic role in moving capital investment and strategy in these companies to be aligned with this long-term future. And let's take 2 degrees as the starting point, because as Anthony said, it might be the political consensus, but it's probably not the scientific, sort of the prudent level that we need to be below that. The third area I want to focus on in engagement that matters, so you need competent boards, climate competent boards, you need the risk reporting that goes with it, but then you need to look at incentives. If you look at the compensation and bonus plans in the energy industry, you will see that senior people are being rewarded for playing the yesterday's game. An increase in proven reserves will ring the cash register very nicely for you, whereas developing a 2 degrees strategy with all the risk and opportunity that goes with that is not baked into incentive plans. So we need to get at the incentives part of this. And then finally, of course, the regulatory effectiveness piece. So we think if those 5 elements are working, you have the potential for a virtuous circle. And that is the arena where engagement makes sense. So let me then come to divestment. In California, there's a new piece of legislation which calls on CalPERS and our sister fund, CalSTRS, which is the Teachers Fund in California, to sell our holdings in coal companies which derive more than a third of their revenues, roughly, from coal. Prior to our boards making the decision to sell, there's a period of engagement, which means we're meant to talk to these companies to find out whether they have a strategy for reorientating their business. Now, unfortunately, it's actually a very small window under the legislation. It's about 6 months. And in our experience, those conversations take more like, we normally give ourselves 3 to 5 years if we think there's some major turnaround in a company needed. However, we've started that process, and one of my colleagues in the governance team has just been in Indonesia, meeting with coal companies in Indonesia. And one of the companies has actually just taken on one of the major consulting firms to actually look at how could they evolve out of coal, where they are very, very heavily exposed at the moment. Others who are just saying, well, whatever, we just run this into the ground for cash ourselves because they're big internal family shareholders. In other words, the internal controlling shareholders are in the same position that we are in. So the question about divestment, I think, is too easily sort of treated as a headline solution. And the Pontius Pilate solution for a fund like CalPERS, if we wash our hands of this and end up with a more pure portfolio and a smaller carbon footprint, it hasn't necessarily done anything to change the strategies of the companies where we've sold our shares, because we can't cancel our shares. We can't bury them in the ground and pretend they're not there anymore. We have to sell those shares to someone else. And you know who's buying up coal shares at the moment. They're not people represented in the room, unless the Koch brothers are here. No? But actually we have to think about that the selling is passing the buck. So the harder, the more difficult, the less glamorous thing to be doing is actually getting the transition in strategy with these companies. Anyway, I think that's enough for now. Unless you want, I've missed anything in your question.
No, but I think that's an important point. I want to leave time for questions, so I'm just going to ask some very quick comments. But on two things which I think are important for us to explore. When you finished.
Wires and.
Well, you're in Paris. Gallant Frenchmen are. How do you put these companies between a rock and a hard place? And I guess that goes for the shareholders as well. So that you have to do something. There's no get out of jail free card. There's no sort of, well, I'm a major commercial pension fund, so I have no remit to divest, so I can just ignore this issue. How do we ensure that the issue cannot be ignored, and you either have to divest or you have to engage, but you can't get away with doing nothing? And I guess we've had this announcement from the Financial Stability Board, and Michael Bloomberg is going to chair that, and it's going to look at disclosure. So, maybe one word from each person, and one word, because I think it's important that people get a chance to ask questions. What would you want the Financial Stability Board working group to recommend? What would be the one key recommendation that would make all the difference? So maybe, let's just quickly run. So a word on each, Gerard, and it is just a word on each. Rock and a hard place, and what would be the one important thing the Financial Stability Board working group could recommend? Or task force?
Well, it's a very, I think to make to focalize on the change agent, on the companies that can be really an actor of the change.
Perfect. Yeah.
I would say I would like the recommendation, which will be anyway on disclosure, and that's correct, to be not only about instant disclosure, instant carbon and climate risk, but about the pathway to 2 degrees. I mean, we need a disclosure on the strategies, on the middle-term and long-term strategies of the companies.
So
that's the main difficulty.
So I mean, which is what in Carbon Tracker's danger zone report, we call for a 2 degrees stress test of the business model. So
Yeah.
that would be, yeah. So Anne?
It needs to be absolutely anchored into required regulatory reporting. So in the US, that's a 10K. It's a risk report that the SEC oversees. We have nothing useful currently in either US GAAP or IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards. We've got to move to a world of integrated reporting where these major drivers of risk and return get put onto the face and the balance sheet of the accounts. And that then gets it within the regulatory ambit. And then that would enable the insurance industry, who ensures the decision makers on the board, to actually be held accountable for being prudent. Because we want to invoke the concept of prudence on this. And that's a very solid bit of the legal framework that's currently abandoned. You know.
Eva?
Yeah, I talked earlier about disclosure, so that's my angle for this as well. Disclosure from a more long-term perspective on the strategy to change the business.
Well, you may or may not want to answer that question.
Yeah. No, I can certainly. The one word is standardization. We counted over 400 separate disclosure initiatives globally. And what we need disclosure of information to prevent financial markets suddenly becoming aware of information and causing financial instability. So disclosure is very key to what we want to see. And standardization will help achieve that. So that's the key requirement, I think, from that project.
And what do you think about it going into accounting, being connected into financial reporting?
Absolutely. We hope it has to be sort of endemic throughout the whole piece. And we start off voluntary, but if it becomes the market standard, it will effectively become de facto a requirement.
Perfect. So do we have questions in the audience? There's a question here at the front. You could say your name and organization, that'd be helpful.
Hi, I'm Michael Tracy with Principium Investments. So, Paul, it was very interesting about what you had said. When you look at the mortgage-backed securities, the issues of 2008 and the massive defaults of AAA-rated mortgage-backed securities, and the investing public in general looking at that saying there must have been this massive fraud that took place because these AAA securities were defaulting as much as what were, higher risks. And it turns out that the calculations were wrong by Moody's and the various rating services of saying if you had a security that had mortgages in Florida and Texas and Arizona and Nevada and California, that geographic diversification was what gave it the AAA rating. Okay, so now here we are. I'm being presented with this new class of securities that are securitizing the risks, insurance risks. And essentially that reinsurance piece that was taking place, insurance companies, the reinsurance market of reinsuring someone else's risk to diversify out a company's risks among other insurance companies, that is now being presented out to the investing public and to guys like me, investment advisors, who are looking at that and saying, well, hey, here's these insurance risks. It's a wonderful income stream. We have these incredibly intelligent actuaries who are going to hold back enough money to cover the potential liabilities that are out there, and it's this wonderful securitization product that's now in the marketplace. When you were speaking, you had mentioned the concepts of typhoons happening all, in various parts of the world, and that giving that liability to various companies. Is geographic, just like in the mortgage space, is geographic risk or the geographic diversification, is that gone away? Is that what we're looking at? Is that there is no more geographic diversification because climate change is everywhere?
Yeah, that is one aspect of the transition risk. The example you give is a really good one. It's an example of overly complex financial engineering coupled with backward-looking statistical analysis about the likelihood of house prices falling in America. And the same problem here. We now, looking forward, could see quite a different pattern of correlations and weather-related events. And so statistical analysis based on past experience may not be sufficient. Now, the cat risk modelers should be able to take this into account, but it is a challenge. We could see those correlations change quite markedly. And you've seen it in recent years in terms of droughts in several parts of the world simultaneously affecting wheat prices, for example. So yeah, this is it's a good analogy.
Okay, do we have any other questions before we end?
Maybe on that point, I'm always amused that in investment advertisements in most markets, there's always a caveat emptor, on the bottom, which says, "The past is no guide to the future." Oh, how true. So if that were just simply to be taken seriously and we had a fresh look at this, exactly as you say, we'd be thinking about interconnected risk, feedback loops, surprises, tail risk as it gets called, fat tails. But I think it's the poverty of the imagination at work. And I think that thinking that investment can be, or judgment can be replaced by algorithms is part of the dangerous game that we've got ourselves into. So I said yesterday, a reckless form of prudence, because we're not taking account of judgment, and it's only through judgment that you can consider the uncertainty ahead and the complexity. And that is that, if nothing else, it is a definition of investment. It's deployment of capital in the face of uncertainty.
And I think that's a good point to finish on. I mean, Carbon Tracker's Lost in Transition report, as you know, we drill into the demand scenarios for energy, and we find within many of these demand scenarios from the industry, and I mean, you can't really pull out anyone within the industry, it's a problem across the energy industry. Many of these demand models for future energy rely on a view that the past is a model for the future, and some very optimistic assumptions about, that the past will continue to represent the future. Very optimistic, assumptions about population growth, GDP growth, but funnily enough, very pessimistic views about the growth of clean technology, which suddenly tells you, in our view, that you need, that they're telling governments and they're telling society you need a lot more oil, gas, and coal than we think is probably the reality. So I think that's, we actually need to change our thinking. In the past, as you say, I think it's a good note. The past certainly does not represent the future. So thank you very much. If you could join me in giving the panel a round of applause.
Well, don't go away, because we're going to just keep rolling here while this panel is exiting the stage. I'm Joel McCower. I'm chairman and executive editor at Green Biz Group. And please come on in and before I introduce the CEO panel. Okay, we're going to spend the next hour or so talking about a couple of topics that are seemingly, they're part of the COP conversation. They're a little bit on the sideline. A panel, we need to continue this. Thank you. I know it's a sign of a successful conversation when it doesn't want to stop, but we sort of needed to, and you're not listening.